During the 1860s, roots for black schools took hold, and almost for the first time, thousands of black children had a slim chance, of getting the kind of learning they wanted. Earlier, a few black schools had helped some blacks read and write, but after the Civil War, many black schools and colleges started to sprout in the South. By 1870, more than 240,000 black students were attending 4,000 schools, day schools, night schools, industrial schools, and schools with growing reputations, such as Howard University, Hampton Institute, Fisk University, and Atlanta University.
In the 1880s, wealthy white Americans pitched in to support black schools. Foundations were started, financed by millionaires. These foundations, for the most part, tried to help these people who needed help the most. But this white support was not given without reason. The whites were financing segregated schools, schools which helped keep black children out of white schools.
Between 1860 and 1900, 260 colleges and universities were financed with help from foundations. Most of the schools were white. Some were black. All helped shape an important American concept. No man or woman should be denied the right to as much schooling as he wants because of the color of his skin.
Many Southerners objected to the idea of education for blacks. According to one Southern doctor, blacks were not capable of learning and doing the same things as whites.
The Negro is a man, but an inferior species of man, who could no more originate from the same parentage with us than could the owl from the eagle, or the shad from the salmon, or the cat from the tiger. He can no more be forced by human power to manifest the qualities or fulfill the duties imposed by the Almighty on the Caucasian man than can either of these forms of life be forced to manifest qualities other than those eternally impressed upon them by the hand of God.
Many Northerners disagreed. They knew that improved education would mean progress for the South. Northern black and white leaders agreed that education could help the South switch from a farm area to an industrial area.
Education for blacks was complicated in a very special way. Everyone had his own idea of the kind of education the black American should have. Some wanted to go all out.
There's no getting around it. The black man has been a slave in this country for more than 250 years. If he's going to adjust to living as a free man, we've got to give him the right kind of education, a free man's education.
Some were cautious and crude.
I said teach him reading and writing, and that's all. You can't feel a doctor's head with all that fancy stuff.
Some said, go slow.
The big thing now is not education, but work. One day, blacks and whites will all learn the same things at the same time. But for now, let's teach the blacks what they need to know to get a job.
Every position had its own supporters and its own logic. But the direction of black education in the early 1900s was not shaped by the force of logic, nor even by the force of need, though that is closer to the mark. It was shaped by the force of one man's personality, Booker T. Washington.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I'm not quite sure of the exact place or the exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect that
Booker T. Washington was a 9-year-old slave when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He couldn't read or write, but his passion to learn broke through all resistance.
I had no schooling whatever while I was a slave, though I remember on several occasions I went as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my young mistresses to carry her books. The picture of several dozen boys and girls in a schoolroom engaged in study made a deep impression upon me, and I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and to study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise.
The odds on Booker T. Washington getting into school were too high to calculate. His family was poor. Every penny counted. Washington had to work in the coal mines of West Virginia.
Like a man out of a storybook, Washington solved his problem by both working and going to school. There was no time for play, little time to rest. Early in the morning, Washington was in the mines, and then off to school and back to the mines.
Washington's mind soon outgrew the local schoolhouse. He set out for Hampton Institute, 500 miles from home. Hitching rides on wagons, walking, he reached Hampton and graduated in 3 years. Then he joined the school's teaching staff.
In 1881, Hampton's founder recommended Booker T. Washington to be principal of a small new school in Alabama. The school was to be called a normal school for colored teachers at Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington stepped off a train in Tuskegee, Alabama in June of 1881 and walked into American history.
Mr. Adams, I'm Booker T. Washington. Where can I find the school?
Mr. Washington, I don't know how to tell you this. See, there is no school, no building, no land, no desk, no books, and no students. The state legislature will pay your teachers' salaries, and that's all they'll do. The rest is up to you.
On the 4th of July, 1881, Tuskegee Normal and Industrial School opened its doors. The black Methodists in Tuskegee had lent Washington their church and a rundown shanty beside it to serve as a school until something better could be found.
My Lord, get me ready for that great day. Hey, my Lord, get me ready for that great and awful day.
Washington spent weeks traveling through Alabama recruiting students. On opening day, 30 students sat in Principal Washington's classroom. By the end of the summer, Washington had 50 students and 1 teacher to help him.
The following year, Washington found a nearby farm and some old slave quarters to house his school. With his teacher and students, he began to raise money to buy the farm. He traveled in the North, making speeches on behalf of the school. Northerners responded warmly to Washington's school. Money and gifts began to arrive at Tuskegee Institute.
Looking back at history, it's tempting to view Washington's achievements in terms of the goals of black people today. At first glance, it might seem that Washington led his people off in the wrong direction in their search for education. But that may be a hasty judgment.
When Washington arrived at Tuskegee, he found a white community opposed to educating blacks. He knew that some education was better than no education, and he saw that local white citizens had to be convinced that the education of blacks was in their best interests.
Tuskegee students were trained to do practical tasks. At school, they built the buildings, produced and cooked the food. The students sold their services and produce to the nearby community. Washington assured the whites that his students were there to learn things that would help not only themselves, but the community.
The whole future of the Negro rests largely upon the question as to whether or not he should make himself, through his skill, intelligence, and character, of such undeniable value to the community in which he lives, that the community could not dispense with his presence. And any individual who learns to do something better than anybody else has solved this problem, regardless of the color of his skin.
Washington won the goodwill of powerful white Southern leaders. He won it by preaching and practicing a form of education for blacks that did not make whites uneasy. His program of training blacks to become teachers, farmers, and mechanics was acceptable to whites and blacks at that time.
It may have been good enough then, but it isn't good enough now.
Who are you?
Let's just say I'm black and bitter.
Bitter about what?
Bitter about Booker T. Washington.
How come?
Washington didn't demand social equality. He went out of his way to please Southern whites. He emphasized farming and industrial training. He wanted blacks to become farmers.
You make the farmers sound bad, but you can also make them sound pretty good.
How's that?
Washington didn't deny the importance of science, mathematics, and history in terms of his people. But he couldn't worry about the end of the rainbow where everything is just fine. He had to worry about the start of the rainbow. And in the agricultural South during the 1900s, that took some doing.
A sellout.
You can call it what you want. Washington is dead, and only his achievements can speak for him. And his achievements say that he didn't sell out. He stepped out and led the blacks toward equal education.
For years to come, the education of the people of my race should be so directed that the greatest proportion of the mental strength of the masses will be brought to bear upon the everyday practical things of life, upon something which they will be permitted to do in the community in which they reside.
That sounds a little like Martin Luther King.
That's Booker T. Washington. And you can find a lot of black and white scholars who say that if there hadn't been a Booker T. Washington, there would never have been a Martin Luther King.
You expect me to believe that?
The only thing I expect and hope is that you'll agree that Booker T. Washington's goal was to help his people all he could. And this was a very bad time for the black people in America. They'd lost almost all they had gained during Reconstruction. Jim Crow, segregation, lynchings, that's what the blacks were facing then. Washington did what he thought was practical and possible under those conditions. He didn't say half a loaf is better than none. He said, if we take half a loaf now, we'll be strong enough to fight for the rest later.
As he traveled across the country on behalf of Tuskegee Institute, Washington's reputation grew. In 1895, he was invited to speak at the opening ceremonies of the Atlanta Exposition, an event rather like a World's Fair. Washington told his audience that the first concern of black students was to prepare themselves to become skilled factory workers, farmers, builders, and tradesmen.
Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands, and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skill into the common occupations of life. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem.
In his speech, Washington stressed that the black man would have to make himself economically strong before he could demand social equality.
No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house.
He reassured his white audience that they had nothing to fear from black progress, that black progress would serve white America, not compete with it.
We shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. There is no defense or security for any of us except in the highest intelligence and development of all.
Black and white alike cheered Washington's ideas, but though they listened to the same words, they heard different messages.
Blacks listened and heard Washington say,
It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours. There is no defense or security for any of us except in the highest intelligence and development of all. We can be one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress.
Blacks heard Washington say he looked forward to the day when they would share all the rights and responsibilities of white Americans. Washington was telling them that the first step on the road to equality was economic independence.
Whites listened and heard Washington say,
The masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands. The agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers.
Whites believed that Washington wanted only industrial and farming skills for blacks. They agreed that with Washington as a leader, America's blacks would not demand the same rights and privileges as whites.
What Washington said and what white men heard may have been two different things, but white men controlled the country, and what they heard counted. Few whites knew that Washington expected the complete acceptance and integration of blacks into American life. They did not know that Washington was secretly financing some of the earliest court cases against segregation. They praised Washington because they believed he would lead the black man toward the kind of progress white men found easy to accept.
Booker T. Washington became the most important black man in white America.
Presidents Roosevelt and Taft consulted Washington on matters relating to black progress. They would ask him which blacks to appoint to federal jobs.
Industrialist millionaires Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller came to Booker T. Washington before contributing money to black schools. He was able to build many schools with these funds.
Statesmen and social leaders turned to him for advice on racial matters. Washington became the chief spokesman for blacks in America, but not all blacks accepted him.
Mr. Washington talks about farms and factories as if that were all there was to American life. I regret to say that he does not voice the hopes and dreams of all black Americans.
If a white man can run a bank, so can a black man. If a white man can write a symphony, so can a black man. Mr. Washington seems to think that black men were put on earth only to serve white men.
A leader, you say? Mr. Washington is not my leader, nor is he the leader of my people. Black people have not elevated Mr. Washington to his high position. It is the whites who have done that.
Whites didn't listen to the blacks who disagreed with Washington. They listened instead to white leaders like President Theodore Roosevelt.
Booker T. Washington was a great American. He has been the most useful as well as the most distinguished member of his race in the world, and one of the most distinguished of American citizens of any race.
Booker T. Washington died in 1915, but the controversy that surrounded him continued to grow. Black leaders were appearing who demanded a new look at Washington's ideas, and that meant a new look at the black man in America. One of the black leaders who disagreed with Washington was to become a controversial figure in his own right. His name, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois.